My name is Rosa Delgado. I am 63 years old, and for most of my adult life I believed that quiet usefulness was its own reward. I was wrong. I spent 31 years as a licensed structural engineer for a mid-sized civil firm in Columbus, Ohio. Not a glamorous title. Not the kind of job that earned me applause at family dinners. But I was the person who looked at a load-bearing calculation and caught the error before the pour, who flagged the soil report that saved a developer 3 years of litigation, who drove out to a job site at 6 in the morning because something in the overnight inspection notes didn't sit right with me. I was precise. I was methodical. I stayed until the problem was solved, not until the clock said I could leave. My husband Ernesto used to joke that I had a sixth sense for hidden damage. He meant it about buildings. He wasn't wrong about buildings. We had one son, Marco. He grew up watching me leave the house in steel-toed boots and come home with blueprints rolled under one arm. He was a good kid, curious, warm, a little scattered, the way children are when they've been loved without conditions. He married at 31, a woman named Brittany, who was from a smaller town outside of Dayton and who had, from the first Thanksgiving forward, a particular way of looking at me that I could never quite name. Not hostile exactly. More like she was appraising something and had already made up her mind before the number came back. They had 3 children in 5 years. Lily, who was 7. Caleb, who was 5. And Nora, who had just turned 3 the month before any of this began. I adored all 3 of them without reservation. That part was never complicated. Ernesto passed 4 years ago, a heart attack, sudden, the kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you meant to say. After that I was alone in the house on Fieldcrest Drive where Marco had grown up, in the same neighborhood I'd lived in for 26 years. The oak tree in the backyard was taller than the roofline. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the cumin Ernesto used in everything he cooked. I kept the house the way I'd always kept it, maintained, orderly, nothing deferred. I retired 8 months before this story starts. Not because I was forced out, not because my mind had slowed, my mind has never slowed, but because 31 years was enough, and because I had a list of things I had been meaning to do since approximately 1997. I signed up for a ceramics class at the Community Arts Center on Wednesdays. I started walking 4 miles every morning, the same route, past the school and the library and the small Mexican bakery that opened when Lily was still an infant. I was reading. I was sleeping past 5:30 for the first time since the Reagan administration. I was, for the first time in a long time, entirely at peace. Some of you watching this right now know exactly what that quiet feels like, and you know how quickly someone else can decide that your quiet belongs to them. I was 3 weeks into my ceramics class. My hands were still learning the clay. It was a Thursday afternoon in early October, leaves just starting to turn on the oaks, and I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a book about the history of the Hoover Dam, purely personal interest, no professional obligation for the first time in 31 years, when my phone rang. It was Marco's number, but it was Brittany's voice. "Rosa," she said, not hello. She had never called me Mom. "I need to talk to you about something." I set the book face down on the table. "Of course," I said. "What's going on?" "Derek's company is sending him to Portland for 3 weeks," she said. Derek was her brother. "And I've been planning to go with him. I've been planning it for months. It's basically a working trip for both of us. He has his meetings, I have some things I want to do out there. It's important to me." I waited. "Marco can't take time off right now," she said. "He's in the middle of that project in Cincinnati and he's there Monday through Friday every week." "All right," I said, still waiting. There was a small pause, the kind that precedes something that has already been decided. Then she said, "You don't do anything anymore, Rosa. You just retired. So you can watch the kids while I'm gone. I'm dropping them off Sunday." The line stayed quiet for a moment. I heard Nora saying something in the background, one of those bright, formless words that 3-year-olds use when they're narrating a world only they can see. I smiled. I said, "I'll think about it." And I hung up the phone. That evening I walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept my files. I opened the bottom drawer. Behind the property tax folder and the utility records sat a small notebook I had started the previous January, 41 pages, filled in the same deliberate hand I used for field logs. I set it on top of the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then I put it back and went to make dinner. I had known Brittany for 7 years by then, and in 7 years I had learned that the phrase "you don't do anything" was not new in her vocabulary when applied to me. It had a history. It had a register. It was the phrase she reached for when she needed to reduce the distance between what she wanted and what she was entitled to, and the most efficient path was to reclassify whatever I was doing as nothing. The first time I heard a version of it was 3 years earlier, at Marco and Brittany's house on a Sunday afternoon in late November. Lily had just turned 4. Caleb was 2 and still unsteady on his feet, that wonderful lurching walk that toddlers have, like they're permanently negotiating with gravity. I had driven over to drop off Lily's birthday gift, a wooden art table, the kind with the tilted surface and the little rail along the bottom to hold the pencils. I'd assembled it in my garage the night before, which had taken 2 hours because the instructions were illustrated in a way that assumed the reader had no spatial reasoning whatsoever. I didn't mind. I enjoyed the problem. When I arrived, Brittany was on a call in the kitchen, pacing in small circles, and she waved me toward the living room without quite looking at me. Marco was at the dining room table with his laptop open. I set Lily's table up in the corner of the playroom while Lily watched with enormous seriousness and Caleb pulled on my sleeve. When Brittany came off her call, she walked into the playroom, looked at the table and then looked at me. "She already has a table," Brittany said. "It's a drawing table," I said. "The surface tilts. It's better for her posture when she draws." Brittany looked at the table again. Then she said, with a pleasantness that had no warmth inside it, "Rosa, you really don't need to come over and rearrange things. I have a system in here." I looked at the corner. The table was against the wall. Nothing had been rearranged. I said mildly, "I just put it in the corner." "I know," she said. "I just mean we're fine. You don't need to keep showing up with things." Marco was in the doorway by then. He made the face he had made since he was 12 years old when he wanted 2 people to stop talking about something, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional turn of his head. I recognized it the way you recognize a weather pattern. I folded the corner of the assembly instructions flat and set them on the shelf. I said nothing. Later, when I was getting my coat on to leave, Brittany came to the front door. Her voice had shifted back to its usual register, lighter, as if the earlier exchange had been a small misunderstanding about logistics rather than what it was. "We're just really busy," she said. "You know how it is. It's hard to have people dropping by." I said, "Of course," and I meant it sincerely, because it is hard to have people dropping by when you have small children and a full schedule, and I had no interest in being an inconvenience. I told her I'd call before coming next time. She said that would be great. I drove home. But I turned that word over on the 40-minute drive. People. Not anyone. Not even family. She had said people. As though I were a category rather than a specific woman who had built a life and raised her husband and driven 40 minutes with a hand-assembled drawing table because her granddaughter liked to draw. The pattern after that was not dramatic. It was quiet, the way structural damage is quiet before it becomes visible. There was the Christmas 2 years ago when Brittany announced, at the dinner table with all of us present, that she and Marco had decided to take the kids to her parents' place in Dayton for New Year's because the kids needed consistency. I had been with them every New Year's Eve since Lily was born. No one looked at me when she said it. There was the March when Caleb's kindergarten had a grandparents' day and Brittany sent me the flyer 3 days after the event. When I mentioned it, she said she'd thought I was traveling, which I was not. I had not traveled since Ernesto died. There was the July 4th when I arrived at the cookout they were hosting. I had been invited, Marco had invited me himself, and Brittany met me at the door and said the kids were already overstimulated and maybe it was better if I came another time. I stood on the front step for a moment. I could hear Lily's voice inside, and the specific sound of Caleb running on hardwood. I drove home. I put a chicken in the oven and ate alone and did not call Marco about it because he was inside with his children and his wife on the 4th of July, and I was not going to make that night into something it didn't need to be. The cold pressure in my chest that evening took a long time to ease. Each of these incidents had its own reasonable explanation, if you were inclined to offer one. Taken separately, each one was nothing. I was well aware that I was not the first woman to sit alone in a kitchen and wonder if she was interpreting things correctly. I had asked myself that honestly more than once. But I knew load-bearing math. I knew what happened when you added small forces to a structure over time and never reinforced the compromised points. The calculation had been running for 3 years, and I had been watching the numbers. I need to go back further than 3 years, because Brittany was not the first person who had looked at the work I did and decided it was background noise. My father-in-law, Hector Delgado, built a small but genuine construction business from nothing, and somewhere along the way he decided that the building of it entitled him to an opinion about everyone adjacent to it, including his son's wife, including me. When Ernesto and I married, I had just passed my professional engineering exam on the first attempt. I was 28. Hector shook my hand at the reception and said with complete sincerity, "It's good that you have something to do." Something to do, as though the 14 months of study while working full-time and planning a wedding had been a hobby, the way some women took up quilting. I remembered that line the first time Brittany said something that required me to set something down and say nothing. I spent the year after Lily was born driving to Marco and Brittany's house twice a week. They were in Cincinnati at the time, Marco's first job out of graduate school, and the drive was 2 hours each way. I went on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I arrived at 7:30 in the morning and stayed until 6 or 7 at night. I did the laundry. I cooked 4 days' worth of food and labeled the containers by date. I bathed Lily while Brittany slept, because Brittany was breastfeeding and exhausted in the specific way that new mothers are exhausted, bone-deep and relentless, and because no one else was doing it. I drove 4 hours round-trip twice a week for 11 months, and I never once said so to anyone. I coordinated Lily's 18-month well-child appointments because Brittany kept forgetting to call the pediatrician's office before they closed. I kept the appointment card in my wallet. I drove Lily there myself 3 times when Brittany had a scheduling conflict. I know the name of the nurse practitioner who saw Lily at every visit for the first 2 years of her life. Her name was Denise, and she had a photograph of a golden retriever on her lanyard. When Caleb was born, Marco and Brittany had moved back to Columbus, 20 minutes from my house. I watched Caleb on Fridays when the daycare was closed. I picked Lily up from preschool on the days Brittany had her weekly team calls, every Tuesday from 2 to 4:30. I knew Lily's teacher's name, Mrs. Okafor, and I knew that Lily didn't like the graham crackers they served for snack, but would eat them without complaint because she didn't want to make anyone feel bad. The summer Caleb turned 2, I rerouted the drain situation in their backyard because water was pooling against the foundation after every rain. I noticed it on a Saturday afternoon while pushing Caleb on the swing, looked at the grade of the yard, and I knew what was happening. I went home, drew a simple drainage correction on graph paper, bought the materials and came back the following weekend with the tools. It took me a full day working alone. The pooling stopped. Brittany never mentioned it. 6 months later she said, at the Sunday dinner table, that they were thinking of hiring a contractor to look at the backyard drainage because she'd read it could cause foundation problems. Marco looked at me. I picked up my fork and said, "That's a good idea," and I meant it in the plainest possible way. In the 6 years between Lily's birth and the October when Brittany called me about Portland, I had contributed approximately 430 hours of direct childcare. I had driven, conservatively, 11,000 miles on their behalf. I had bought school supplies, winter coats, a car seat when Caleb outgrew the first one, a sound machine for Nora when she was an infant who wouldn't sleep, a replacement part for Caleb's bicycle when the derailleur cracked. I had sat in pediatric waiting rooms and preschool orientation sessions and a small gymnasium on a Tuesday morning for Lily's second-grade winter concert, which Marco and Brittany both missed because of work conflicts they couldn't avoid. I had done all of this without an invoice. Without a thank you most of the time. I had done it because I loved those children with a ferocity that had no floor, and because being useful was the shape my love took, and because I had learned a long time ago that the work of women like me was most clearly seen when it stopped. I was planning to let it stop on its own schedule slowly, as the children grew older and needed me less. That had been my quiet plan. Brittany accelerated the schedule. I did not call Marco that evening. I thought about it the way you consider a road and then choose a different one. Marco was in Cincinnati during the week. He was stretched thin in ways I understood and did not hold against him. And there was something I needed to understand clearly before I brought him into any of it, exactly what Brittany had said and exactly what she expected to happen next. What she expected, I was fairly certain, was this, that I would call back within 24 hours, slightly flustered, and agree. That I would arrive Sunday with my overnight bag and spend 3 weeks managing 3 children's school schedules and meal requirements and the specific emotional weather of each individual day, and that when Brittany returned I would hand the children back and go home and we would not discuss it, because we never discuss things, and because my silence had, over 7 years, been reliably available. My silence had been an asset she had learned to budget around. On Friday morning, I drove to the county recorder's office to pick up a document I had requested the week before, a record search I'd been doing for a neighbor with a property line question. I handled it in 20 minutes. On the way back, I stopped at the bakery, the small Mexican one on the route I walked every morning, and bought a coffee and sat at the table by the window. My phone rang at 11:47. It was Brittany. "Rosa," she said. "I need to confirm Sunday. I'm packing and I need to know you have the kids' schedule." I squared the notepad in front of me before I answered. "I haven't agreed to anything yet," I said. A pause. "What do you mean?" "I told you Thursday." "You told me," I said. "Yes. I said I'd think about it." "Rosa." Her voice had shifted into the register she used when something wasn't going as arranged. "I have a flight. I have plans. I told you you're retired. You don't have anything going on." I looked out the window. A woman was walking past with a small child on her hip, the child pointing at something on the other side of the street with great urgency, the way children point at things they cannot name. "I have ceramics on Wednesday," I said. A brief silence. That's a class. That's not the same as a commitment." "It's a commitment I made," I said. "Brittany, let me ask you something." I kept my voice even. I had kept my voice even for 7 years and I was good at it. "What is the schedule?" She told me. Lily had school Monday through Friday, drop off at 7:50, pick up at 3:15, plus Tuesday afternoon gymnastics at 4:30 in Westerville. Caleb had kindergarten in the mornings, 8 to noon, plus a birthday party the second Saturday. Nora had no school but needed a nap at 1 and had specific preferences about what she would and would not eat and could not be left unattended on the stairs. I wrote it all down. "And Marco?" I said. "Marco is in Cincinnati all month," she said. "He can't help with this. That's why I'm calling you." "I see," I said. "So you'll do it." I had not said that. I had written down a schedule and asked a clarifying question. These are not the same as agreement, though I understood why she had read them that way. I had been agreeing for 7 years by the mechanism of not saying no. "I'll let you know by tomorrow morning," I said. Another silence, longer this time, and I could feel the shape of her frustration pressing against it. "Rosa, I need to know today. I need to finish packing." "Tomorrow morning," I said. "I'll call you at 9. I hung up. Not abruptly, I said goodbye clearly before ending the call. But I ended it. I sat at the table for a moment. The coffee was still warm. Outside, the woman with the small child had stopped at the corner, and the child was still pointing, and the woman was looking in the direction the child was pointing with patient attention, trying to see whatever it was the child could see. I left a tip on the table and walked to my car. That evening, I opened the desk drawer in the living room. Behind the property tax records and the utility folder and the accordion file where I kept the children's medical information I kept, not Brittany, not Marco, I kept it because I was the one who needed it at 2 in the afternoon when a pediatric office asked for Caleb's immunization dates. I pulled out the notebook. I read it from the beginning. It took me about 40 minutes. Then I closed it and set it on the table and looked at it for a while. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Her name was Patricia Okonkwo, and I had known her for 12 years, since she handled a contractor dispute on a job site I'd overseen in 2012. She was exact, she was economical with her words, and she did not ask unnecessary questions when she understood what was being asked. I told her what I was considering. I told her what I needed. She listened. When I finished, she said, "I can have the draft to you by Monday." I said that Monday was fine. I thanked her and ended the call. I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer, on top of the accordion file, where I would be able to find it quickly when I needed it. Then I went to the kitchen and made dinner, and I ate at the table where the low October light had been earlier in the day, and I thought about ceramics and the way clay changes temperature when you work it, and I thought about Lily's very serious face when I set up the drawing table, and I thought about Nora pointing at things she didn't have names for yet. At 9 o'clock the next morning I called Brittany. "I'll watch the children," I said. She said good. "I knew you would." I said, "There's something I'd like to discuss with you when you return." "Sure," she said, the way people say sure when they are not listening. "I'll see you Sunday, Rosa." I said goodbye and hung up the phone. I had 3 weeks. Brittany came back on a Sunday 22 days after she left. I knew the flight time. Marco had told me the way he told me things during those 3 weeks, in short texts, apologetic in tone, never quite addressing what was underneath them. He had driven down from Cincinnati that morning and arrived at the house a few hours before Brittany's flight landed. He looked tired in the way he had looked tired for most of his 30s, a tiredness that had settled into the area around his eyes and stayed there. The children were good. I want to say that clearly because the children were not part of what happened next and they were never going to be. Lily had gotten 100% on a spelling test in the second week and had insisted on calling me Abuela Professora for the rest of the afternoon, which made Caleb laugh so hard he fell off his chair. Nora had learned to say my name in full, Rosa, not Abuela, just Rosa, with great precision and satisfaction, the way toddlers say words they have recently conquered. I had gone to ceramics on both Wednesdays. I had made the schedule work because I had been making schedules work for 31 years professionally and considerably longer than that personally, and the logistics of 3 children were not beyond me. I had also made 3 phone calls during those 3 weeks. 1 to Patricia. 1 to the county recorder's office. 1 to a notary I had used twice before, a quiet man named Gerald who worked out of a small office near the library. I was at the kitchen table when Brittany came through the door. Marco was in the living room with the children. I could hear Nora saying something in the direction of whoever had just arrived, because Nora said things in threes when she was excited. Brittany set her bag down in the entryway and came to the kitchen doorway. She looked rested. The trip had agreed with her. "How were they?" she asked. "They were wonderful," I said. "Lily got 100 on her spelling test. It's on the refrigerator." Brittany glanced at the refrigerator. "Great," she said. She was already moving into the ease of being home, the particular loosening of the shoulders that happens when you return to your own space. "Thanks for doing this, Rosa. I knew you'd be fine." "I wanted to talk to you about something," I said. "When you have a moment." Something in my tone made her look at me more directly. I was sitting with my hands flat on the table, the way I used to sit at the start of a difficult project meeting, not tense, not performative, just settled. "Now?" she said. "Whenever you're ready," I said. "It won't take long." She poured herself a glass of water. Marco appeared in the doorway, read the room the way he had always been able to read a room, and said he was going to take the kids to the backyard. I heard the back door open and Caleb's voice rise immediately into the outdoor register children switched to without thinking. Brittany sat down across from me. I reached into the folder I had set on the chair beside me before she arrived. I took out the first document and placed it on the table between us, face up, squared to the edge. "This is a personal care agreement," I said. "Patricia Okonkwo drafted it. It documents the childcare I've provided over the past 6 years, dates, hours, tasks, associated costs calculated at the standard market rate for licensed childcare providers in Franklin County." Brittany looked at the document. She didn't pick it up. "What is this?" "The total hours are 431, I said. "The associated cost at the current county median rate for in-home childcare is $62,400. I kept my voice even. "I'm not billing you. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" I reached into the folder again and placed the second document beside the first. "This is a formal record of the childcare arrangement I've been providing, now made official." Patricia filed a copy with the county. "It establishes on the record that the care has been provided, that it has value, and that it has been provided voluntarily until now." Brittany's eyes moved between the 2 papers. "I don't understand what you're trying to do here." "I'm going to explain," I said. "You told me when you called that I don't do anything anymore. You meant it as a reason I should be available. I want to make sure we both understand what I've actually been doing." I took out the notebook. 41 pages. I set it beside the other 2 documents. "This is a log I've kept since January. Dates, times, what I did, what I brought, what I handled. It starts with the January morning I drove Nora to the pediatrician because you had a conflict and Marco was in Cincinnati, and it ends with last Wednesday, when I took all 3 children to Caleb's friend's birthday party and sat in a party venue for 2.5 hours because there was no one else to do it." The kitchen was quiet. From the backyard I could hear Marco's voice, low and patient, saying something to Caleb about the sprinkler. Brittany said, "Rosa, you're making this into something it isn't." I squared the notebook on top of the other documents before I answered. "You called me," I said, "and told me I don't do anything. I want you to know what doing nothing has looked like." And then I looked at her directly for the first time since she sat down. You said 7 years ago that I didn't need to keep showing up with things. I had just assembled Lily's drawing table in your playroom. I said nothing and I came back the next time because Lily needed someone to come back. Brittany opened her mouth. You told me 3 years ago that the kids needed consistency over the holidays, at a dinner table in front of Marco and the children. I had been there every New Year's Eve since Lily was born. I said nothing and I drove home, and I was at your house on New Year's Day with food I had cooked, because the children needed feeding and I was available. You sent me the Grandparents' Day flyer 3 days after the event. You told me you thought I was traveling. I have not traveled since Ernesto died. I said nothing about that either. I reached across and placed my hand on the notebook, not sliding it toward her, just touching it. You told me this month that I don't do anything anymore. But the log starts in January and I have not missed a single thing those children needed in 6 years. Not one. Brittany's voice when it came was tighter than I had heard it before. I never said you weren't helpful, Rosa. But you come over without calling, you rearrange things, you act like their grandmother, I said. Yes. That landed in the room and stayed there. After a moment I said, I'm not here to fight with you, Brittany. I'm here because I've decided something. I am happy to continue being present in the children's lives. I love them without condition and that won't change. But I will no longer be available as a default resource when a plan falls through and Marco isn't reachable and you need someone who doesn't have anything going on. I paused. If you need childcare, I am delighted to be asked. Properly asked. And I will tell you whether I'm available. She stared at me. That's it, I said. That's what I wanted to tell you. Marco came inside 20 minutes later. He knew something had happened. He looked at the table, the documents, the notebook, Brittany sitting with her arms crossed and her water glass untouched, and he did the thing he had done since he was 12, that fractional turn of the head. But this time he didn't look away from it. Mom, he said. What is this? Sit down, I said, and there was something in my voice that he hadn't heard in a long time, maybe ever, the voice I used in project meetings when I needed people to stop performing and start listening. He sat. I told him plainly what I had told Brittany. I told him the hours. I told him about the drain in the backyard, which he had not known about. I told him about the Grandparents' Day flyer. I watched his face as I talked, and I watched the particular quality of his stillness, the way his expression moved through discomfort and recognition and something that was very close to shame. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Brittany said, I never told her she wasn't appreciated. Marco looked at her. Then he looked at me. Mom, he said, and his voice was different now. I didn't know it had gotten to this. I know, I said. I didn't tell you. That's also something I've decided to change. He was quiet again. Then he said, the drain. You fixed the drain and never told me. It needed fixing, I said. And I knew how. He put both hands flat on the table, the way people do when they are trying to find solid ground. I'm sorry, he said. I mean that. I told him I knew he did. It was Brittany I watched more carefully in the days that followed, because Brittany was the one who had been named, and Brittany was the one who had to decide what to do with being named. People who have never been held accountable for the small accumulated cruelties, the logistical ones, the ones done with pleasantness and reasonable explanations, sometimes respond with more reasonable explanations. Sometimes they go quiet in a different way than before. Brittany went quiet in a different way. She called me the following Wednesday while I was at ceramics. She left a voicemail. Her voice was measured, careful, the voice of someone who had been thinking about what to say. She said she hadn't realized how much I had been carrying. She said she thought it would be easier going forward if they could talk through things more directly. She said she was sorry for what she'd said on the phone about doing nothing. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I set my phone down and went back to the clay. I didn't call her back that day. I called her the next morning at 9, the way I'd been calling people at 9 when I had something important to say. We talked for 20 minutes. It was not a transformed relationship. It was not a healed one. It was something more modest and, in its modesty, more real. Two women who had been circling the same set of facts for 7 years and had finally agreed to look at them at the same time. Patricia filed the care agreement and it stayed filed. Not as a weapon. As a record. As the thing I had always known engineers carry into difficult conversations, documentation that does not require the other person's memory to be accurate. Marco called me that Sunday. He drove out to Fieldcrest Drive with all 3 children and without Brittany. She needed the afternoon, he said, and I understood, and we raked the leaves in the backyard together, Lily and Caleb competing over who had the biggest pile, Nora walking directly through every pile that anyone made, and Marco and I talking the way we used to talk when he was young and the yard was smaller and the oak tree was not yet taller than the roofline. He asked me at one point whether I'd been planning the documents for a long time. I said, since January. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You always were the one who noticed things before they became a problem." I handed him the rake. "That's what engineers do," I said. "I've had some time now to sit with what happened, and here is what I know. I spent 31 years in a profession that trained me to see what others missed, the stress fracture inside the finished wall, the settlement beginning beneath the slab. I was good at it. I am still good at it. And yet I spent 7 years applying that skill to everything except the structure I was standing inside. I think I told myself that patience was the same as acceptance, that enduring something quietly was the same as choosing it. It isn't. Patience is a posture you take toward a situation while you wait for the right moment. Endurance without intention is just waiting for the damage to become visible, and by then it has already been happening for a long time. The Notebook was not revenge. I want to be clear about that. I have no interest in revenge. The Notebook was a record, the way all good engineering begins with a record, with someone willing to write down what they actually see, not what they hoped would be there, not what it would be more comfortable to believe. What I learned at 63 is that invisible labor doesn't stay invisible because no one is looking. It stays invisible because the person doing it hasn't yet decided that it deserves to be seen. That decision belongs to no one else. Brittany said I don't do anything anymore. What I was actually doing was building 41 pages of evidence that I had never stopped. There is something I've noticed about the women of my generation, the ones who drove 4 hours round trip and fixed the drains and kept the appointment cards and said nothing. We were taught that the work speaks for itself. It doesn't. The work is silent. You have to speak for it when the time comes in your own clear voice with your records in order. If someone in your life has ever told you that you don't do anything, if someone has ever looked at your labor and called it nothing because it didn't come with a title or a paycheck or a plaque on a wall, I hope you're keeping a record. If this story found someone who needed to hear it today, share it with them. The people who've been called nothing have usually been carrying everything. This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes. Names, events, and characters are invented. Any resemblance to real persons or situations is coincidental.